In this video, we'll be talking about panoramic photography with the Fujifilm GFX system. Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. In this video, I want to share what is, I guess strangely, one of my favorite features of the Fujifilm GFX system, and that is the ability to preview a photo in a 65:24 panoramic ratio. Now, I've always loved panoramic images, so the ability to do this in camera is something that I really appreciate. And so, for the next 15 minutes or so, I'd like to walk you through some of my favorite images that I've made with this setting, and chat about why it's such a great compositional tool. Now, what I won't be discussing here is stitched panoramas. Those are a whole different beast and require not only sort of careful planning, but software stitching and a host of other corrections to be made just for them to work well. So we won't be talking about those in this video. Now, most modern sensors are primarily sort of 3x2 or 4x3 in shape, but for a lot of my work I find that there's just too much vertical space when I'm shooting horizontally, and so I actually work with wider aspect ratios quite a lot of the time, and a lot of my images that I deliver to my clients are actually cropped to 16:9 for the same reasons that we're going to discuss in this video. But the aspect ratio we're going to be using here today is just a little bit wide for a lot of my couple and family photography, so I typically reserve it for personal work. So as a final note, Fujifilm, if you are watching, I would love to see this ratio in the X series cameras as well, as I use it quite a bit. The 65:24 ratio is almost the same, if not exactly the same, as Fujifilm's X-Pan film camera, and so it's often sort of affectionately known as the GFX-Pan online. But in this video, I'm going to be referring to it as 65:24, as that's what it's labeled in the camera. And regardless of what it's called, that long, thin aspect ratio, it sort of demands and allows for a few different compositional techniques and sort of storytelling abilities. So we'll discuss those in this video. Now, as you'll see over the course of this video, it allows you to get an awful lot into a single frame without feeling like you've wasted too much space. So let's jump in and take a look at some images. As a human with two functioning eyes, I tend to see the world in sort of a long, thin slit. And as I began to learn photography, I noticed pretty acutely that there were a lot of things above and below my vision that could sort of either help or hinder my compositions. And when they help, those things allow us photographers to create sort of very complex compositions that tell a different story to, what a non-photographer might do. But when they hinder, they make it really difficult to make interesting images of a scene that may have too many distractions at the top and the bottom. And one of the major reasons that I like to work in panoramic formats is that they allow me to cut off a lot of that sort of top and bottom, those boring elements in the vertical direction. In a scene like this one, where the foreground and the background don't really add much to the image, 65:24 can be a great ratio to show that wide-angle scene without having to worry about what to do with that sort of boring space at the top and the bottom. The empty sky and the endless ripples in the water are simply cropped out. Now, you could argue that zooming in would also solve this and make the subject larger in the frame and thus easier to see, and that is also a valid composition for this scene, but I feel like it doesn't do justice to the overall scene like the panoramic does. I love having the mountains coming down on either side and giving me a sense that this man is sort of alone in the vastness of this foggy river. Here, the long thin crop allows me to juxtapose the two men at either end of the frame, and that's sort of what initially drew me to make a photograph of this scene. And some of the challenges that I faced were that although that blue building on the left continues well above the man's foot, the grey fence on the right only continues another few pixels above the crop, and after that it becomes an extremely bright section of sky and trees. Also, below the wheels of these two tricycles, there was some, pieces of garbage and other mess that I didn't feel added to the composition. And again, the 65:24 ratio allowed me to clean up the lower and upper parts of the image while still showing plenty of information from left to right. Another thing I love to use this aspect ratio for is to make images about a particular action. Now, for example, with this image, my eye goes straight to the water pouring from the urn, and then it follows the holy man's arm up to his robe, where I get sort of looped around to the boats and then back to the urn. Now, if I included his face, it's sort of very likely that my eye would just sort of get stuck there and I wouldn't be able to explore the image. Now, had I made a close-up of his action in, say, perhaps a 3:2 ratio, we wouldn't have anything other than the urn and the water to look at. Now, all of these are valid ways to compose the image, of course, but I wanted you to see what was happening and where it was happening without focusing too much on who was doing it. Another good example of this would be this image of a bracelet maker in Jodhpur. The man had an amazing lined face that, to use a cliche, could tell 1,000 stories if I included it. But if I had, it would be all that we would want to look at. And it's also, because he's looking down, would have been quite dark, so I opted to just sort of photograph his hands and feet, which I feel tells an equally important story about this man. And it also allows me to use his crossed legs as a very strong sort of horizontal element to pull your eye into the center of the frame. And these become a much more dominant element because of the length of the crop. The nature of the long, thin frame means that it directs the viewer's eye in a very different way from the comparatively sort of squashed ratios of like 3:2 or 4:5 or something like that. Now, take for example this image of a boatman in Varanasi. Here I'm able to include a good amount of the city on the left-hand side of the frame while pushing him all the way towards the right. And not only does this tell the story of where we are quite effectively, but it allows me to create a line that leads to him. The oars here also create additional horizontal lines. If, for example, I'd photographed this image as a 3:2 ratio, it may have ended up something like this. In that case, the line of the city doesn't really draw you quite as strongly towards the boatman as it does in the panoramic. The image also feels a little bit more static to me. Now, if I left the line of the city in and just extended the sky area to the same 3:2 ratio, the city would again lose its impact. It would lose that drawing line. The sense of isolation and space that can be created with a 65:24 image is also very useful. Now, I love to take my subject and place them close to one of the edges in order to give them sort of a lot of room to breathe in the frame. And because of the shape of the frame, this naturally puts a lot of space around most subjects. This image is of the same holy man who was pouring the water earlier. Now, by this time he had stood up and was allowing the water from the coconut bowl to go back into the holy river Ganga. While he was certainly not alone, as you never really are in a city the size of Varanasi, cropping out all of the boats and people at the bottom and leaving only the out-of-focus city as a background helps in sort of giving the sense that he is doing a very solitary activity. On top of that, the elongated 65:24 crop and leaving a lot of space in front of him really helps to sort of tell that story. And just imagine for a moment if I had cropped out the left-hand side of this image. It would be a very, very different photograph. Here again, I'm able to include a lot of space around the man, but including significantly more space in the direction he's facing adds to that sense of sort of isolation that the water creates for me. Now, you could wax poetic about how it represents the distance he still has to go in life, or how the holy river might dominate the majority of his life. The decision here to work in 65:24 was primarily to do with the shape of the river from my perspective. I didn't want to show either shore, which would have sort of taken away from that sense of isolation by giving stopping points to the image at the top and bottom. In this image as well, I was trying to create a sort of a sense of isolation. Now this man, like many in Varanasi, was in a world of his own, but sort of with mess and clutter all around him. So I decided to work with the clutter-free space above his head to try and create a bit of a different image. Now, it's definitely possible to make sort of interesting compositions working in this ratio vertically as well. I've actually made several of these vertical images in 65:24 with the GFX, and I really enjoy making these as well. Now, the issue comes though when you actually try to display them. If the images remain digital, you run up against the fact that display mediums larger than a phone are typically oriented horizontally, and that results in using a very small area of the display and, sort of a loss in impact. But printing, though, can be quite impactful with images like this. One idea I did have for digital display while preparing this video would be to actually create vertical triptychs, and this is something that I might do in the future. Now, I don't have any that I've produced so far, but I feel like these three images from the Ganges River actually work quite well side by side, and it's something that I might explore going forward. Another thing I love to use this ratio for is to include a little bit more context about a given subject. Now, sometimes when you crop too wide with formats like 3x2 or 4x3, you end up getting a lot of dead space that doesn't really contribute to the scene, or just ends up distracting the viewer from what you actually want them to look at. Now, I find that with 65x24, it can be much easier to give additional context without really distracting the viewer from quite a small subject in the frame. For example, the subject here is clearly the woman preparing the pineapple on the right-hand side of the frame, but with the wide crop, I'm able to include the men drinking coconuts in the background, the motorcycle, and a good portion of the street to sort of give you an idea of what's going on around her. I find that my eyes explore the image quite a bit, but still find their way back to her every time. Now, of course, the depth of field contributes to this, but I also find that these sort of long, thin frames encourage the eye to explore left and right a lot more. The same applies here, I feel. You have the hoses, the man, and the bicycles, all as sort of clues as to what this man does. Now, your eye is encouraged to explore while still return to him. Now, that could have a little bit to do with the contrast between him and the background, but I find myself in this sort of constant loop as I look at this image, and I really enjoy exploring it, even though it's quite simple. And much like the other photographs here, this image could have been made in so many different ways. It could have been composed in almost any ratio, and it could have been made in either orientation. But I chose the 65x24 ratio here because of the empty space on the left and right. The symmetrical nature of the scene just begged to be taken in it. Now, I feel like the monochromatic and symmetrical base of this Buddha statue really draws you straight into the figure in front of it. Also, leaving out the Buddha's face means that we don't get stuck trying to look at that. The other thing with that is, of course, the Buddha's face was up quite high, and it would have meant I had to include the bright sky as well, which I really didn't want to do because it would just distract you from the bottom of the image. The only thing that I might change with this image would be to move the person praying right into the middle of the image, but it would have been quite rude, I think. This image is of a caretaker sweeping snow at Changdeokgung, one of Seoul's palaces. Now, the sense of space that you get when you pass through this first gate is quite something. There aren't many large open spaces in Seoul, and so this one has a sort of a special feeling as you arrive. On this morning, we'd had quite a heavy snow, and that really helped to give the sense that this entire place was just sort of walls and a path. And the 65x24 ratio here not only allows me to take out the unnecessary sky and snow, but it accentuates that sort of horizontal emptiness, that space in the frame that we don't normally get in Seoul. I hope you've enjoyed taking a look at these few images with me. There are quite a few more in the slideshow following, so please do stick around and check those out as well. Now, one thing I would love to hear from you is what you think about this sort of panoramic ratio. You know, is it something that you've used before, something you might use in the future? Is it something that would even work for your own photography? You know, is it something that might benefit or take away from yours? And do you love these images as much as I do? I'd love to hear from you guys down in the comments. And as always, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. And if you haven't already, please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers.